Okay. Good afternoon and welcome, SciCommers, to our February Mentor Chat. I'm Amel Hussein, and I'll be your host and moderator for our session today. SciCommers is an online community and network for science communicators, including writers, journalists, engineers, researchers, and others who really care about making science clear, accurate, and engaging for many different audiences. And each month, we invite a guest mentor to share insights from their work and to open up an honest, practical conversation about science communication, careers, challenges, and the craft. So today, I'm thrilled to introduce our February guest mentor, Joelle Zaslow from Boston Children's Hospital. Joelle works at the intersection of healthcare and communication, helping clinicians and researchers turn complex pediatric science and medicine into clear, usable stories and resources for families, staff, and the broader public. Her work spans the full arc of science storytelling, from concept development to communication strategy to the final structure and delivery of a story. So just a quick note on logistics before we begin. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You can type your name and where you're joining us from, what you're hoping to get out of today's session. And then Joelle is going to present for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll move into a moderated discussion and Q&A. You can also use the chat feature to type in your chats at any time, any of your questions, and I'll keep track of them as we move the conversation forward. So Joelle, thank you so much for being here with us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and to be chatting with all of you. I'm Joelle Zaslow. I'm I said, I'm the manager of research and science communications at Boston Children's Hospital, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today about telling the science story, strategy, structure, and process. And as I was, oops, sorry about that. Let's see. So as I was putting together this presentation, it's really about exploring how scientific ideas take shape. And that's taking something from concept to communication. So what do you do with a piece of science once you have it? How does it get from that to the blog post, the video, the press release, or whatever that end product is? So really thinking about the process all along that way. And so some of the questions that I kind of want to hope to answer for you in the next 40 minutes or so is what makes for a good story? What makes for a compelling narrative? Why will people be interested in what you're telling? How can we get people to care about research? I think, this is a challenge of getting folks outside of our little bubble to care about what you're talking about. And so we'll cover a little bit of that. And also, does it have to be an all or nothing approach? And this will make a little more sense as we go along, but does it have to be either you go all out and cover something fully, or you just say no to a researcher, no to covering something? I will talk about sort of the spectrum that I see this on. I'll also talk about how we can tailor communications for different audiences and really meet folks where they're at from a wide array of different audiences. And then I thought it was really good to sort of end my talk talking about some of the current challenges and barriers to success. I think given the current political climate we're in and a lot of other barriers, I think it's just really important to talk about those challenges and also opportunities within that. So before I go into all of that, I have been working in the Boston healthcare science landscape for over 12 years. I came to Boston in 2007 to come to Emerson College for my undergrad, and I came in thinking I wanted to do marketing. And about a semester in, realized that that really wasn't for me. And so I pivoted into communication studies. And there was a class I took my senior year called Intro to Health Communication. And this class just sort of like blew my mind wide open. I had never thought about communication as it relates to health and how you can really like be strategic about how you're communicating as it relates to healthcare, to clinical care, and everything in between. And so that really stuck with me. And so when I graduated, I took some time. I worked as a grant writer at a local nonprofit, but then really realized that I wanted to take my career in the direction of health and science. So I took a position at Tufts University in their Friedman School of Nutrition within a grant-funded research program. And I started out there doing grants and finance for them. And at the same time, I got my master's in health communication from Tufts, their School of Medicine. And so while I was working at Tufts, I kind of like caught the research bug. I just was working within this research, this grant-funded research program, and just thought it was so fascinating to watch research take shape and to really see how that can inform care and really move the needle forward. So from there, I took a role over at Mass General in their research institute and help them communicate about a lot of their science and really get the word out about their research. So throughout my career, I've worked in a lot of different sectors, though. I worked at United Health Group for a little bit, and I also did a quick stint at a Medicare startup. So I've really seen sort of how the sausage is made in terms of health insurance. And I think that's a really important perspective to have when you're working in healthcare to really understand that side of so that just like that side of the coin and to really understand how that area works. I also I worked at a communications agency and my client was the CDC. And this was in 2021. So I have some very fun stories I can tell at another time about working with the CDC at the height of the pandemic. And then most recently, I was over at Harvard in their stem cell and regenerative biology program and their Harvard Stem Cell Institute, overseeing communications for both the program as well as the institute itself and communicating about a lot of the amazing research going on there. But that takes me to where I am now at Boston Children's Hospital. I've been here for a little over a year and a half, and I oversee all things research for the community for the hospital. And that looks a little different every day. I do a lot of sort of media pitching, so doing outreach to media outlets as well as getting incoming requests for interviews. But I also, what I do a lot of is working closely with our researchers, with our leadership to really keep my finger on the pulse of research and to figure out how we're telling the story of science at the hospital at a strategic level. Really thinking about how and when we're communicating about certain stories, thinking about sort of broader narratives, and just being really strategic about that. And sort of the thread throughout my career has been partnering with researchers and institutions to tell their story and elevate their work. I especially really love working with organizations where research isn't what they're most well known for. So both Mass General and Boston Children's have incredible research programs, but I think both of them are firstly known for their clinical care. So I love working with those sorts of organizations. To really elevate their research brand and make it as well known as their clinical care. So I thought I'd start off with sort of like, what am I looking for when it comes to what and how I communicate science? And I think what it really comes down to is research that tells a story, that tells a compelling narrative. Why would a reader want to tune in? Why would a user want to engage with your work? And I think it really has to have some sort of a story to it. And I think that there are a lot of different elements to that. I think one is if it can have a translational or broader impact. Is it specific to one condition, or can it be applied? Can this research finding be applied across a number of different disciplines? Is it applicable to something that has a larger conversation or part of the current events? I also will be providing examples throughout, sort of as case studies and just showing you how I've applied a lot of my thinking into my actual work. So to start out, I thought this one was a great one to show in terms of thinking about sort of this broader translational impact. Our division of genomics and genetics and genomics. Sorry, I had to print out my notes. So if you see me looking down, I just have a few little notes that I'm going to be taking note of as we chat here. But so they had a paper publishing in Science that looked at CTE, which we most often think about in football players. And so what they found there was using single cell genomic sequencing, they found DNA damage in the brains of CTE patients, the brains of former CTE patients, and it was similar to Alzheimer's disease. So it's suggesting that CTE is not caused by just repeated traumatic head injury, which is a lot of what folks have been thinking about. And so when I heard about this paper, a few sort of, signals went off for me. I think one is the connection between CTE and Alzheimer's disease. Um, I think thankfully we've had a lot of research come out in the past few decades that looks into Alzheimer's disease, and we're getting a better understanding of those mechanisms. But CTE is still very much a black box in a lot of ways. So being able to make that connection between CTE and a disease that has more, we know more about it, I think has a lot of relevance. And I think CTE, just as a condition in general, is a big topic because of its relation to, the NFL and a lot of these high profile areas. So as you can see, this got covered by CNN and it got picked up by a number of other outlets. And I think that's because of it having that broader translational impact. Another piece is the compelling human angle. And I think this is a lot easier in terms of a patient story when you're working at a place like a hospital where you can find a patient who was really impacted by the clinical trial or by a research finding and being able to sort of tell that story. But what I also love is finding the personal connection for a researcher. So maybe they have like a personal connection to the topic that they study, or they just have an interesting story to tell by themselves. And so one example for this one is when I was working over at Harvard, um, I did a profile of Sam Watrous, who was a human developmental and regenerative biology concentrator, which is the program I was working within. And he went on to establish his lab at Mass General. And I think this tells such an interesting story because it's also what every postdoc dreams of being able to go from their degree and open their own lab. And so this story kind of provides a little bit of hope for those that are out there, but I think also just weaves this really great tale of Sam's journey throughout Harvard from undergrad to grad and then to eventually starting his own lab, while I also sort of incorporated into it a lot of his research, which was looking at blood stem cells in zebrafish and how they interact with macrophages. So I sort of wove together this story of the science as well as the personal narrative of Sam's journey through Harvard. And I was really happy with how the story came together and was able to get it published in the Harvard Gazette, which has a pretty good reach over there. And then the last question is that I like to ask myself is, if I were a reporter, what about this story would interest me? And I think that's needing to be relevant to your audience. Why should a busy reporter, take the time to interview your researcher, to write the story, to fact check, to do all the things that they need to do to get that story out there? And it has to go beyond just an intriguing research finding. I don't think that's enough of a hook usually to compel a reporter to cover your research. So an example that I love to give is this research that we had published earlier this year in Nature Health. So our Chief Innovation Officer had combined traditional surveillance methods with AI-enabled tools to geographically map county-level MMR vaccine estimates. And they were able to create this interactive map that if you zoom in, you can look at the county level of measles risk level. And again, I heard about this research and I got this little, this light went off for me because I think it has a few really compelling angles to it. I think, unfortunately, measles is becoming big in the news again due to the recent outbreaks. And I think vaccination rates are also something that's really a hot topic right now. And it was also showing using AI in this really interesting way, using AI for good, which I think is also a really compelling topic. And as you can see, this also got covered by ABC. More locally, the Globe covered it. So I think outlets really saw the value in something like that. So I was, I think it was sort of being able to connect with the reporter and have them see the value in it. So I think I wanted to also share some like questions that I consider when I'm thinking about my approach. And so one is, could it be understood by a lay audience? And this goes into, I think sometimes I've come into this, I like box myself into a corner when I'm trying to distill a really complex topic down, and it just gets lost in translation when you're trying to redefine a lot of these really technical, really sciencey words. and it just loses its meaning. And that's okay. I don't think everything is meant for a lay audience. And that's, we can have it not be, something that's meant for the lay audience. We can think about tailoring it to other audiences, which we can talk about later. I also think about this spectrum of how significant are the findings, and I see this as going from preliminary findings to groundbreaking and everything in between. So maybe a preliminary finding is, we first discovered X gene, or we first discovered the inkling of something. And then that can go all the way to groundbreaking of, we found a cure for X disease. And that's a really, a wide spectrum. And we want to be really mindful and strategic about where along that spectrum, where along that line you're communicating about that and you're sharing that story. And then the last question is it niche or is there general applicability to the field? So maybe a researcher has found something that relates to a very specific cancer. Is there generalizability across other cancers, or is there generalizability, like as we saw with the CTE, to Alzheimer's? Is there sort of that translatable component to it? And so I ask myself these questions because I think it really helps you think about what's the cadence? When are you telling these stories? And a great example that I like to show for this one is a researcher that I've been working with for a number of years, Ryan Flynn, who I worked with over at Harvard, and then when I came to Boston Children's, I've been following his work over the years. And back in 2021, he had recently established his lab over at Harvard and had just had a paper come out in Cell that was first reporting how RNA can be found outside of the cell. And this is really intriguing finding at the time, but there was a lot of sort of hesitance, challenges around proving that what are called these glycoRNAs, that they truly exist distinctly in molecules. So over the years, I've seen him publish these papers in high impact journals, Cell, Nature, and then most recently, earlier this year, he published this paper in Nature that finally was showing that the larger implications of these cell surface RNAs and how it relates to cell communication and processes like angiogenesis. So I think this is such a cool example of going from preliminary finding to, moving along that line towards groundbreaking, towards having larger implications. And I think a lot of this also goes back to relationship building. Ryan has been keeping me in the loop about his research so I can sort of know when new things are coming out and be really thoughtful and strategic about how much effort we're putting into certain things because especially at Boston Children's, I am a mighty team of one. So there is one of me. So I need to be really thoughtful of how am I spending my time. And I want to make sure that I'm putting effort behind these big papers and that can only happen if researchers are keeping me in the loop and we're having this two-way conversation. So drilling down a little more, I actually shared this slide. I did sort of an internal presentation for one of our science, one of our programs, and I showed them this slide and they found it really helpful. So I thought I'd sort of share what goes on in my mind when I'm thinking really about the channels that we're using and using sort of this tiered approach. And these are applicable to the channels that I have at my fingertips at Boston Children's. So I think of the tier one as a simple post on our research LinkedIn page. It's a really low lift, but I think there's a lot of win to it. I think it goes really far in what I was just talking about when it comes to relationship building. I really hate to have a researcher come to me and say, I have this paper coming out. Can you help me promote it? And I just say no. I think that really cuts the relationship and really discourages that two-way communication that I really hope to be building with folks. So being able to tell them, we can't put out a whole big media narrative around your story, but we can put a post up on the LinkedIn page. So it makes them feel good. It's a low lift for me. It's just sort of a win-win all around. So then we get to the next tier up, which would be that plus maybe considering including it in one of our targeted e-newsletters. I work really closely with our marketing team, and they have a lot of specialist emails for, neurologists, urologists, and everything in between. And if I get a paper that could be applicable to one of their specialist newsletters, I'll reach out and ask if they can include it in there. And then going one further, we have a tier three. And so we could think about this of, okay, now we can put some more long form, can do a long form story for it we have an answers blog, which is sort of our own content blog. So we can think about doing a story on there, or I'll put together a little blurb to post on Eureka Alert, which for anyone who isn't familiar is sort of like the wire for science and research. I'll also utilize some of our internal communication channels. We have an intranet, we have a newsletter that goes out, our president sends out an email on a weekly basis. So leveraging some of those internal channels, which I'll also talk about later of how important your internal audiences are as well. I'll also think about maybe pitching it to a more niche or smaller media outlet, if that could be applicable. I also really make sure that I'm coordinating with our affiliate organizations. As a Harvard Medical School teaching hospital, I work really closely with my colleagues over at Harvard Medical School, and I also do the same with the Broad or Dana-Farber if they have affiliations there as well, to really make sure that we're coordinating our efforts, that we're not, recreating the wheel, but we're just coordinating and making sure that all of our efforts are complementing each other and that we're all in the loop on what's going on. I also, with this one, may consider doing social media on either our main LinkedIn channel, which has more followers, or creating content for Instagram and TikTok if it feels like there's a visual component there. And then tier four, which does not happen very often, but when it does, it's, all resources on deck. So we can think about pitching the story to a larger outlet, your CNNs, your New York Times, really going to that elevated level. And then also we can think about doing sort of a video narrative, in addition to a written story to tell a more cohesive, full picture of the research. So I think an example that really brings a lot of these concepts together really well is at Boston Children's, we have the Children's Rare Disease Collaborative. And it involves over 100 physician scientists as well as patient families across the hospital. And what they're really aiming to do is identify the genetic causes of rare diseases and provide families with genetic diagnoses while also translating those discoveries into research-informed care. And first heard about this when I first came to the hospital and just got really excited about the potential here because this cuts across so many different areas of the hospital. And in speaking with some of the folks that lead the CRDC, I was able to get some patient success stories. And I've sort of looked through those and found some really compelling narratives there, and I thought could really tell a great story. So, two examples from this. One is with ASA, who was having a lot of these like mysterious gastrointestinal symptoms. And when he met with the CRDC and he got genomic sequencing, they found that he has this ultra rare mutation on the SLC10A2 gene. And he's the sixth person in the world that has this. So ultra rare. And what this meant was he had protein that needed to transport bile acids, but his liver was trying to compensate by overproducing this bile, and that flooded into his intestines. And by getting this diagnosis, they were able to find medications that sort of reversed a lot of what was happening in his intestine and removing the excess bile. And now Asa is good as new. He's, living a normal life, being a healthy kid. And so I worked with our science writer at the time to put together this blog story that talks about Asa's story. And there's, in this story, if you scroll down, there's a bunch of photos of him like eating ice cream and all the foods that he was never able to eat. So this really great story. And then at the same time, there was also a paper that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine that was really comprehensively defining the genetics of congenital diarrhea, such as ASA's. So it really blended nicely this patient story as well as this science story and really melded the two together and made a really great case study of the CRDC and its capabilities. And then I had one more that I'd love to show, and this is involving Amelia, and she has nystagmus. So I'm going to try to get this video to play, so bear with me for a sec here.
Amelia is so funny and so bright. She is adventurous and she explores, and nothing holds her back. We noticed Mia's dancing eyes around 3, 4 weeks old. We later found out that was nystagmus. So her eyes would just dart back and forth. And under certain stressors, we would notice it would get worse. So in bright lights, we would notice her eyes would dance a little more. So when we met with the doctors here, it wasn't even a second thought to go with further testing. And my husband and I were both in the office. All three of us got swabbed and we waited for genetic testing. Achromatopsia is by having both CNGB3 recessive genes. It has to be on both parents, and I had no idea. My husband had no idea. So it was a complete surprise. Having answers changes the entire game when it comes to our lifelong goals for our daughter. We've been able to go through early intervention services and have a teacher with visually impaired that comes and works with Mia and make sure, she's hitting all of her milestones. And without having that diagnosis, we would have never been able to have access to those services. She amazes us every single day with what she can do. She's not lacking. She's not missing out. She wears her glasses. She has the best day.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, one adorable child, and I think just makes such a compelling story, a case study of how the CRDC and the genetic testing that they were able to provide really changed the life for this patient family. I think that's such a compelling example of how video can tell that story in a way that sometimes written content can't always do that. Okay, so then moving forward, I want to talk about sort of thinking about your audience. And I think a lot as communicators, we hear the phrase of meet them where they're at. And, what does that mean? It feels kind of trite. But when I'm thinking about that, I think it's both meeting them in the channels that they're using. So when we think about, say, like a lay audience, they're using social media, they're using streaming services. So we're thinking about the channels that they're using, but also what are the topics that they're interested in. Um, you know, what is going to make them stop what they're doing? What is going to compel them to listen or to watch or to read whatever it is you're offering to them? If it's not relevant to them, they're probably going to scroll right past it or, not click on your link. Um, so I think we really need to be thinking about where they're at. And so, as I said, with lay audiences, we can think about, social media, streaming services. And I think what I've learned with lay audiences is they want to learn. They want to learn about new things. And you just need to be able to catch their attention because attention spans are so short these days. So with lay audiences, you have that opportunity to educate them, but you just have to be really creative about how you're going about that. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, I also see such an importance with internal audiences, especially when you work or you are at a large institution like I'm at Boston Children's or when I was at Boston or at Mass General, you have thousands of individuals who you already have their email addresses. And this is such an audience that is just ready to be tapped and to reach out to. So I think it's really important to think about how to tailor your communications to those internal audiences. And I love to give this snapshot of science as an example for this. This was during my time at Mass General, and back then we had just started out kicking off this new newsletter that provided a monthly overview of all of the new high impact papers that had published over the past month in high impact journals. And what I would do is put together a list of all of those papers and provide short summaries of each of those papers. And that got sent out to our 3,000 plus research community. And this had incredible results. We had something like an 82% open rate, which for busy scientists is kind of unheard of. And we were getting such great feedback. And then I would get engagement from researchers asking how they could be featured in it. So it was really, promoting that two-way communication that I really strive for and that relationship building that I really strive for. And I think it broke down a lot of silos that we often see within labs and within research communities. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of folks want to know what their peers are doing, whether it's out of sheer curiosity or it's, a little bit of competitive, what are the other folks doing? I think there is an interest in folks knowing what's going on with the people around them. So this checked a lot of boxes and I think really shows the importance of understanding your internal audiences and how to best engage with them. I think another one is also donors. If you especially work for an organization where philanthropic funds are such a big part of your budget, and that's where a lot of the places that I have worked, that has been the case. And with donors, they are, they're not just a lay audience. A lot of them are very well informed on a specific research topic. If that's what they're funding, they might have a personal connection or just there might be an area of interest to them. So they're more well-read and they understand more of the science. So it's tailoring your communications and your level of depth that you're going into in terms of your language to cater to that level of education, that level of understanding. And one example that I thought of for this one was when I was over at Harvard, I oversaw the production of our annual report, which went out to the donors, anyone who donated to the Harvard Stem Cell Institute over the past year. And I put together summaries of some of the most high impact work that had come out from the past year as a result of the philanthropic funds that we received, and put together little summaries of each of those and put this into a PDF, a comprehensive PDF to send out. And I take no credit in the design of this, by the way. I am not a designer. Really happy with how it came out, visually, but I think the visuals really play well with these summaries that I put together and really paints a really beautiful picture of how donors and how the philanthropic funds they provided really made such an impact over the last year. And then the last audience that I'll talk about are reporters. And I think I've, sort of been touching on this throughout my talk, but reporters, I think we need to be thinking about how can we engage them? What is the hook for them? What's in it for them? They're very busy. They're, pulled in so many different directions. So, it's not enough to just bombard them with pitches and hope something sticks. We really need to be strategic and thoughtful about who we're reaching out to and what topics we're reaching out to them about. And I think that sort of lends itself well into a discussion just around the current media landscape because so much has changed even in the last 2 years. And I think a lot of that has been a result of the current administration. We have a new crisis every day. Are there news cycles are so fast, it just seems like we get whiplash from what's going on in the news every day. And that relates to our reporters. They are so, they're so ingrained, they're so, focused on what's going on right now that I think a lot of stories that maybe would have been covered if you had pitched them a few years ago are not getting covered anymore. I'll pitch some research and think, oh, this will absolutely be relevant to a reporter, and I'll either hear crickets or I'll get a quick response that just says, "This is great, I don't have time." And I can sympathize. I understand exactly where they're coming from. It's really hard to be able to cover some of these, stories that maybe aren't quite as time sensitive when it feels like everything is on fire. So I think the current news cycles are really a barrier to anyone who works within the media landscape, within science communications, and even broader. I see my colleagues who don't work specifically in science, but just in healthcare in general. It's really a struggle right now to get stories out there the way that we used to be able to get them out there. And I think related to that is also that press releases aren't what they used to be. It used to be that you could put a press release on the wire, put it out, and that did the job for you. And that is not the case anymore. Press releases just don't have the same weight. So we need to be creative. I still think there's a lot of merit in using Eureka Alert strategically. I'll still use that. I'll put together a blurb and put it out there, but that's only one tactic. That's not enough. We need to be thinking more cohesively than just a press release, just a eureka alert because it's also a lot of time. It's in time intensive to write that all out, to get the quote from the researcher, to put that all together, and the ROI is pretty low. So I think press releases don't have the same weight. And one challenge that at least I'm coming up against is that a lot of researchers don't quite understand that. So it's also, again, going back to that, I sound like a broken record, but I think a lot of it is relationship building and having them trust you enough that they can understand why a press release isn't important and that they can trust that you have their best interests at heart and that you will be finding other avenues to communicate their science. Um, I think without that established trust and credibility, it's really hard to go to them and say, we're not going to do a press release for this. It'll cause a lot of conflict and mistrust. So yeah, it's a challenge. And I think everyone that I've been talking to is coming up against this of how can we be creative? How can we be thinking outside the box when everyone is thinking outside the box? How do you break through that? Um, I think it's an ongoing challenge, and I don't have any easy answers, but I feel like it's important to bring that up and as I'm talking about a lot of these things because I think we have challenges now that we've never seen before. And I think that leads me into some lessons learned that I thought I'd impart on all of you. And I think one that connects to a lot of what I was just talking about is be ready to adapt and be flexible. It's funny, as I was putting together this presentation, I was looking through my portfolio and, seeing all the things that I put together over, 10, 12 years. And I'm really proud of everything, but there are some things that I know just would not be effective today. When I think about my time in Mass General, a lot of my time was spent churning out content for a blog 3 times a week because back then I think blogs were still such a relevant way of getting information out there and people really engaged with that long form content. And that's just not the case anymore. People don't have the attention spans, don't have the time to read and sift through that long form content. We need to be thinking shorter. We need to be thinking quick. And yeah, so blogs, if I were to, think about that today, I don't think I would put together a blog in the same way. I wouldn't approach it in that way. So I think be ready to adapt and learn new technologies. Nothing makes me feel like an older millennial than trying to learn a new technology. A few months ago tried to learn CapCut, which is like a video editing software, and it was such a humbling experience to learn how to edit videos and how to think in this way and create, cute little captions but I think that's what we need to do. We need to be willing to try new things and to learn and to grow our skill set to stay relevant. Communication is one of those fields that isn't going to stay the same. So I think just having that commitment to consistently evolving, I think on a personal and a professional level is so important. And if you have the resources, like I next month am going to the big Association of Science Communication conference in Portland, Oregon, and I am so excited for this. I am just really excited to be amongst peers, but also just to get inspiration from others and to really hear what they're doing, what they're finding works well for them. Maybe take some ideas back with me to impart here at Boston Children's. So I think those opportunities to learn and grow, if you have the time and the resources, or go online and take a class, or any way that you can to stay up to date and be open to learning and trying new things, I think is a big lesson that I continue to impart into my work. And then I think sort of my parting thought is to find the so what. With whatever research piece you have, it's really finding the story, finding why should someone care about it. It's not enough to just say, we discovered this. You need to provide the context and you need to think about your audience and how are you, translating that so what to make them care about it. And that's, it's not going to be a one size fits all approach. I think it's going to be different angles for different folks depending on what's important to them. So I think it's, meeting folks where they're at, understanding what their interests are, what their concerns are, what their barriers are, and kind of going from there in terms of creating an effective piece of science communication that will really, compel and engage your audience. So with that, thank you so much. Thanks for listening to me chat for this long. I am kind of a soft-spoken person, so talking for this long has been is a unique challenge for me, but I really appreciate the time and I'm very much open to questions, comments.
Well, thank you so much, Joelle, for walking us through your approach to strategy, structure, and process. I really appreciate it. And I really love to shift us into a reflective conversation about your experience and what it means for those of us who are growing in this field. So I'll get us started with the first question. And to everyone with us today, you can feel free to raise your hand or put your questions in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with. But this is really informal. When you look at today's science communication landscape, what do you think people most misunderstand about telling a really strong science story? What do they get wrong?
Mm. It's funny, I was actually chatting with someone earlier today about this. I think from a communication side, it's sometimes over-promising or making generalizations. And I've sometimes gotten this feedback when I've written something and given it to a researcher to review. They'll say, "We can't make this leap from we found this discovery to this could be, this could treat X disease." I think especially when we're working with more basic or bench lab scientists, it's sometimes hard. We want to be able to make that leap from this tiny discovery to clinical impact. And I think, yeah, I think that's something that we as science communicators can sometimes get wrong of wanting to find that meaning and not, we're just not there yet when in terms of certain pieces of communication. So I think that's a one that I think on the communication side that we often get wrong.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. Okay, we have a question from our audience. Niyati, you can take yourself off of mute and please feel free to ask your question.
Hey, thanks, Joelle. Lovely talk. I enjoyed it a lot. This is Niyati. I just wanted to ask, I saw on your website that you do have a degree in communications, in general. So for those of us who do not have a degree, but are interested in being able to write as good as, you do, what would you say is the one thing that you think back and can confirm that that's the one thing you learned from your degree versus something that you learned from, doing your job, and that's something which you didn't learn when you were in school. So what's your take on this? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that question. Okay, so something that I learned from my degree that I think is actually has surprised me the most is I took a class on biostatistics, which is nothing to do with writing, but and I struggled through this class because I am not a math person by any means, but it gave me an understanding of how to be critical of the science and how to really assess and understand what the numbers and what those, what the whole results section of a research paper, what is that actually saying, and how can we translate that into written language? So when I think back to especially my master's, I think that was like the most helpful class for me, and I use that on a daily basis when someone sends me a paper and says, "Is this worthy of communicating about?" I use a lot of those lessons that I learned. Yeah, on a regular basis. But I think something that I have just learned in working, I started out as a freelancer during my master's. I realized that in order to get a job afterwards, I needed to build up my resume. So I did some freelance health writing, and I found that really helpful. And it was for an organization that was looking for student writers. So I think any organization that is looking for those sort of student writers or is open to folks that don't have a ton of writing experience, I found that incredibly helpful to both build up my resume, but also build up my skill set as a writer and to also hone my health writing, which I think is, I think a lot of us have to do essays and all of that throughout grade school and into early college. But I think getting a voice and understanding how to specifically write for health and write for science is a specific skill set that I don't think we need to be learning in a classroom. I think you can get that from freelancing and from getting those sorts of experiences that help you get your feet wet.
Great answer. Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? If we don't, that's okay because I have many more. So I'll go ahead and ask another question. I'm really curious about your writing practice. When you begin a piece, do you usually see the structure of your essay or your piece from the beginning, or does that emerge through reporting and revision and your conversations with folks in the field? So if you could talk a little bit about your writing practice and how your story emerges.
Yeah, I think it depends. I think sometimes I will have a catchy hook from the get-go for like a lead sentence that I'm just like, yes, I'm gonna start there, I'm gonna build it from there. But sometimes that the lead doesn't come until the end. So I think it very much depends. And I like to think of it sort of as this puzzle. And sometimes I'll write out little blocks that I know that I want to include and then figure out a way to weave that all together. Sometimes I can just go start to finish and go in chronological order, but it depends also on I think both how much I personally am understanding the science. If I feel like I need to be going in and doing some Googling and doing some more research myself, that process might look a little more different than if it's a subject that I'm more familiar with or excited by. I think there's so many different elements that will influence that. But it definitely depends. I definitely don't have sort of like a one size fits all approach. And then I always love to go back when I can and have the luxury of time of like writing something, having a draft and going back to it even, in that afternoon or the day after. Because sometimes I'll go back and say, I don't know what I was thinking. Why did I think this works? And sometimes I am so impressed by my writing the day before. So I think it's really helpful to have like a fresh set of eyes if you have the time to take a break, get a breather from it, and come back to it.
Yeah, I totally agree about that incubation period. Sometimes it's really powerful, and when you come back to it, it all flows. So I appreciate that. I see Niyati, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yes,
Please.
I do. Only if someone
Okay.
else doesn't. Um, I had a question about the generalizability you talked about.
Mhm.
And I maybe you have experience in this, maybe you don't, but how does one pivot from very niche topics to say non-science degree holders? I know that, citizen science is one way of doing it, but given your background has been in Boston Children's School and Harvard, which, they are academic like organizations, universities, institutes where you are, the audience is primed to kind of understand and take in information very differently than the general audience. So say hypothetically, if I wanted to highlight a subject which is like not so well known, but the research on it is very important. So in your experience, how would you say, and I know, you talked about Instagram, TikTok, but for that you probably need some following. It's like a vicious circle. So are there any, I hate to use the word tricks, but are there any like, like shortcuts, quote unquote, that you have learned that kind of can garner attention more from like the real audience as opposed to scientists who are reading your newsletter, for instance?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think if it's a topic that maybe a lot of folks don't know about, if there's a way of drawing parallels between that and a condition that maybe folks do know more about, I think being able to make similes or, metaphors or comparisons is a really effective way of getting a reader to follow along with you to understand the topic. And then I think that also, thinking about followers or folks that would engage with your content if you're thinking about a topic that has more of a following anyway, and then they're able to sort of connect that with what you have going on, I think that's a great way to engage. but yeah, I mean, I think communicators come across this on so many ways of how do you grow a following when you don't have a following. And I think it's a slow process. We've even been seeing it. So we started our research LinkedIn page, I'd want to say about 2 years ago, and we're a very well-known institution, and we're still seeing such a slow growth on that page. And sometimes it really takes time, and that's frustrating. And it's like watching paint dry, of watching the number of followers slowly tick up. But I think it's also like on places I think about like LinkedIn is being part of other conversations and trying to just sort of insert yourself into those conversations to be relevant. So it's sort of just staying in the know of what conversations are happening and how can you plug in from there? How can you make your content relevant to what the other conversations are like already going on?
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions while you're thinking about that? For many early career communicators, interviews can feel intimidating. So I was wondering if you could share some of your tips about any questions that you ask that tend to unlock really compelling stories or help you tap into that human element with respect to like maybe some of the disorders that you see in your work or pediatric health stories. How do you bring up that emotional element to the story?
hmm Yeah. And I don't think that is you'll always find that component, but I think it just goes back to seeing researchers as people first. Um, I still sometimes struggle with that of going into talking to someone who is so well known, who has all these accolades and all these publications. But I think just reminding yourself that they are also a person and to speak to them that way, I think really humanizes them and humanizes yourself. Going in without just going, okay, straight to the questions is building a rapport goes such a long way and just, yeah, humanizing them. And then I'll come in with a set of questions and then also kind of see where it takes me. And then also asking questions like, what excites you about this? Or in the field in general, like, what are you excited about? And I think researchers are so passionate about the topic that they're involved in that I think tapping into that and yeah, just sort of letting them sort of geek out a little and ask them like what they're excited about. And even if you end up not using all of that content, I think that can go a long way in building that rapport and creating more of a conversation rather than just a simple back and forth Q&A sort of interview. Yeah, I think that really helps to just ask questions that might lead somewhere else.
I agree. That's really, really powerful. And I love like humanizing that person, even though they're an expert in their field or an academic or, what have you, or very well prominent figure in their field. They are a human just like us. So, approaching it that way can be really helpful and make it just feel more natural, the conversation. So thank you for that. Um, I'll open it back up for questions from our audience. So, for some of our SciCommers who are early in their journeys, what's one skill or one habit that you would encourage them to intentionally practice over the next few months that could help them with their storytelling game?
Mm. Yeah, okay, so I think I have two. I think one is kind of thinking about what I said about like finding the so what is like, why would someone care about it? And sometimes I'll think about it in terms of like, if I were to explain this to my family, who is not, they're not at all related into the science field at all, why would they say, oh, that's really interesting. That's really cool. So I think thinking about that story and where is the hook within that I think is a really good practice of just asking yourself in your head when you're looking at a piece of research or thinking about science in general. Um, and then I think the other piece is when going back to what I was talking about with my biostatistics class, which is just being critical of the research and really thinking about it from that direction too, of yeah, just thinking about, okay, so this paper is out, but what is there? Like why is it important? Why are they talking about it? And also just sort of, yeah, understanding what is the significance within what they're saying in their paper. I think there's a nuance there of just sort of being able to be critical about as you're reading a piece of literature or whatever it is just really being thoughtful around yeah, just what are they saying? What is the significance there?
Excellent. Looking ahead, what trends do you see shaping the future of science storytelling, specifically in healthcare settings? What are some of the trends that you're seeing come up, and how will that shape our future in science
Yeah.
storytelling? Mhm.
Yeah, as I said, I think there are such unique barriers right now that I don't think we've ever come across. And
Mhm.
so I'm definitely seeing shorter form content taking the lead. And I think just being more part of conversations. And so I see a lot of opportunity with LinkedIn right now. And that's why I'm really pushing, our strategy towards doing some more content around LinkedIn. And I'm in the process of building out some more plans around that I'm really excited about because I think for scientists specifically, um, with Twitter not being what it is anymore, I think that back when I was at Mass General, Twitter was the place where all researchers were, and that was where their dialogue was happening. That's where all the conversation was. And since Twitter has sort of not, delved away from that, I'm seeing LinkedIn becoming a lot of like that new place where folks are having those conversations. So I think there's a lot of opportunity within there to be part of those chats and meet researchers where they're at in that way. And then I do think short form, and I think more visual content. And I think also within video and visual content is also humanizing the research, showing the folks behind it. Especially I think with research funding such in jeopardy, I think showing the people behind it is so important to humanize it and to show the importance that it's not just, a lab bench. It's the people behind, that are working in that lab bench that make it so important and make it run.
Right. Well, Joelle, thank you again for sharing your time and your experience and such thoughtful examples with us today. It's been incredibly valuable to hear how you think about science storytelling from concept to strategy and real world hospital settings like the ones in Boston. So thank you for all that you're doing, and thank you to our audience for contributing to this session. Before we sign off, I'm really excited to give you a preview of our next mentor chat. So in March, we'll be joined by Dr. Emily Costa on Wednesday, no, it's Thursday, March 12th. Our SciCommers chats are always on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern, and her session is titled From Pub Trivia to Civic Science, Finding Your Path and Your Voice in SciComm. So she's going to talk to us about how her playful, informal spaces like pub trivia and other community-based activities can become powerful entry points into civic science and public engagement, and how you can use those experiences to discover both your path and your voice as a science communicator. So we hope that you'll join us next month and invite your friends and colleagues who might be curious about getting involved in SciCommers. And with that, we'll wrap up for today. Thank you again, Joelle, and thanks for everyone for being here. And we'll see you at the next mentor chat. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.